We are live. I'm number 2, Red Reviews, the podcast where we talk about a variety of books from a Marxist and anarchist perspective. And I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks, Corey. It's great to be here. We're getting towards the fall months. It's still fairly warm here in Indiana, but you said it's been starting to get kind of chilly up in your neck of the woods.
We did get our first snow today.
Oh, wow.
It's already gone, but it showed up today.
We got some sleet last weekend. There was like a period of like maybe 2 minutes. It was last week when sort of the effects of Hurricane Milton, where we got sleet for like 2 minutes and then it went away. And it all melted. It was gone. But yeah. So, but I think that's all relevant because as we were talking about in the pregame, I'm only in my early 30s, but I can tell you right now that the climate I live in today feels very, very different than the climate I grew up in. Everything feels like it's a month behind where it actually should be.
Yeah.
And I think obviously that has to do with climate change. And that goes into talking about our book tonight. Now, people are going to probably ask, okay, they're doing another degrowth episode. I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself. I was inspired by a very interesting Jacobin piece by Lee Phillips and Matt Huber about the book we're talking about. And that inspired, I'm like, well, I need to read this book. I need to read this book because their review is quite damning of it. And I'm like, okay. I respect them very, very much. And some of their points I think are fairly valid.
I find that more and more I find spots where I think I disagree with Lee Phillips on them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair. So we've talked about sort of the broad range of opinion about ecology and socialism. And when we talked about Jason Hickel's excellent book, Less is More, that book just sort of was very, very good and very detailed. And I liked it very, very much, but it didn't have it wasn't particularly one particular tendency on the left. Like it didn't have a particular perspective.
It wasn't a Marxist book.
It wasn't a Marxist book specifically. And this one is.
Okay.
And so tonight we're going to be talking about Slow Down, the Degrowth Manifesto by Kohei Saito. Kohei Saito is a professor of philosophy in Japan. He is a recipient of the Isaac Deutscher Award for his contributions into Marxist history and theory. Okay. Isaac Deutscher was a very influential Marxist who wrote generation-defining biographies of Trotsky and Stalin, and wrote a variety of other really intriguing and interesting essays on Marxism. We might do one of his books on the podcast in the future. Okay. But, so for me, I'm like, okay, well, he's won the Deutscher Award. Okay, so he's got his Marxist bona fides, right? He's legit. But he has a very radical interpretation of Marx that often, I think, which is what makes Huber and Phillips a little upset with, or disagree with, rather, not emotional thing. So it's a good book. I like it a lot. I think that he is doing something really different and interesting with interpreting Marx in a very new and vibrant way that is unlike traditional interpretations of Marxism on ecology.
Okay.
And so I think when you get into that, you get a sense of, this book also opens up like the classic debates about the early Marx versus the late Marx, and are they different or are they the same? Is there continuity or is there change? Like that's part of the discussion here. But also it's about Kohei Saito makes the case that towards the end of his life, Marx is questioning some of his fundamental assumptions about capital and about capitalism and about ecology.
Okay.
So to kind of get us started with thinking about the book, much like Hickel's book, it starts with a discussion of where we are and what's going on with the world and with climate change. And he much like Hickel does, he makes the case that the sort of Green New Deal style of sort of, big sort of, big gig or sort of big kit versions of solving this problem don't necessarily work, and they don't work for a variety of ways. Part of it has to do with the fact that degrowth fundamentally believes in creating an economy in which people's needs are met, but that that we have sort of a steady state where we're eventually either sort of having a sustainable use of energy and material throughput, or we're going down, where we're using less energy or we're using less material.
Right.
And overall. So that's what degrowth is. That I agree with. I don't think, I mean, I don't see any reason to disagree with that.
Yeah.
And I do think that the challenge that we face is pretty dire. I mean, Saito lays out very clearly, much like Hickel does, that we are facing many environmental crises all at once. We could very much see the destruction of very core components of our ecosystem in our lifetimes, whether it's components of the polar ice caps or the Great Barrier Reefs or coral reefs in general, which are a big storer of carbon, to the horrific effects of deforestation, especially in the Amazon, the inefficient use and the wasteful use of water, and how water shortages will contribute to crop issues. I mean, we're in a situation where if current trends continue, agricultural output could be halved by 2100 or earlier. So there are real serious challenges. And Saito makes the case, as does Hickel, that this solution of just sort of like greening capitalism doesn't work, and sort of like taking big kit socialism and sort of throwing like an eco sticker on it isn't going to work either. And part of it's the technologies aren't there. So, carbon sequestration technology is not particularly effective yet. You also have the untried sort of geoengineering.
Right, yeah.
Where you could
almost
where they could put aerosols in the air to sort of block the sun's rays. I mean, all of these, but again, these are very untested technologies. Yeah. Many of them are in their infancy. The other thing, and this isn't in the book, but I do think is extremely relevant, is the growth of AI and the use of massive server farms and the growth of server farms to fuel this AI, bubble that's in our tech sector right now. And so, Eric Schmidt, one of the founders of Google, basically just came out and said, yeah, Google's not going to make its climate goals. It's just not. And we don't care. We're going to blast right through them because we think that with our investments in AI will help us figure out the solution, as if the solution isn't already there, which it is. And so I think that's all stuff that is fairly new. I think that's not fairly new, but it's fairly treaded ground. We know that. What's new about him is specifically his Marxism. Hickel has a broadly sort of leftist perspective, but it's not any one particular tradition, whereas Saito is explicitly a Marxist. The earlier version of this book, I think, was called Marx in the Anthropocene, and he's written a couple other books about these topics.
Okay.
And he's sort of basing his view on a fundamental reimagining of Marx and Marx's relation to ecology. And so when we think about it, the traditional way in which we think about Marx is we think about socialism is something that comes out of periods and stages of development. We've talked about this before. Traditional Marxism often looks at it as you go from sort of hunter-gatherer societies to the development of agriculture, then eventually you develop sort of the feudal system and the feudal mode of production, and then feudalism transforms into capitalism, mostly due to the crises and contradictions of feudalism. And out of the crises and contradictions of capitalism will emerge socialism. Mm-hmm. That's the sort of traditional way of doing it. And the way that we get to socialism is by expanding our places of production, by growing our technological capacity, by growing our economy to a place where eventually we can have a socialist economy that is built upon the foundations that were laid in capitalism. That's the traditional way of looking at Marxism. Mm-hmm. And Saito kind of puts that on its head and says that towards the end of his life, Marx had sort of a theoretical break with what he had written before.
Okay.
And he talks about the he talks about how Marx sort of gave up on the notion of progress, like the sort of the idea of technological progress, or the way that, sort of assumed stages of production. So you have to go through this to get to this. You have to go through capitalism to get to socialism. Yeah. So those are Marx, in his estimation, changes. And what changes him is his study of ecology. Okay. So Marx starts studying the work of a guy named Justus von Liebig, and the influence of the concept of sort of the metabolic, the notions of metabolism. And that doesn't mean just like the metabolism, like, oh, I burn this many calories a day, but social metabolism, an economy's metabolism. And how there is at some point going to be an irreparable rift between the capitalist mode of production and ecology. And Marx is writing about that specifically in the context of Liebig's research on soil depletion in Europe. So Saito takes that a step further and says, well, if you actually look at some of the stuff that Marx wrote that's unpublished, that's not in Capital Volume 1, it's not in the Grundrisse, the notebooks. You look at some of what he's written there, and specifically his letter to his letter to a person named Vera Zasulich, which is in 1881. Vera Zasulich was a Russian socialist who was in support of these agricultural communes that were developing in Russia. Remember, in 1881, we're 20 years out from the abolition of serfdom. Serfdom is abolished in letter, not necessarily in practice, but in letter in Russia in 1861. So we're barely a generation out from that decision, where Russia is already on its path to be going from being a sort of feudal, mostly agricultural society to becoming one that is capitalist and mostly industrial. And in this letter to Zasulich, which Saito sort of holds up as a big, this is a big deal. This piece of evidence is a really big deal. And he sort of builds his case upon Marx's writings to Zasulich, where Marx makes the argument of, well, maybe societies don't necessarily have to go through capitalism to get to socialism. Maybe they can build their systems differently. Maybe they can work on these agricultural communes. And he specifically mentions Russian agricultural communes as an example of this, which we would see, well over, half a century later in the agricultural communes in Spain, during the 1930s, when we've talked about that before too. So there's evidence to suggest, like, in terms of the long-term thinking, Marx may have been right. Yeah. But what Saito makes the argument of saying is that, look, see, this is Marx sort of getting rid of his sort of mechanistic view of history, where it has to go through certain stages. It has to do this in order to get to socialism. See, he's sort of rejecting that. He's rejecting that notion of progress with a capital P. Right. Now, some of that's true, but I want to sort of, basically, I think there are many different versions of his letter to Zasulich. He wrote 3 or 4 different drafts before he actually wrote to her. Okay. And his actual reply to her ended up only being about 350 words. And we're just going to go through it real quick. Because one of the things that's really frustrating about Saito's book, despite how much I did like it, he never just ever directly just gives you, here's what he says. Okay. He's always interpreting it and giving you quotes, but he's never just given it to you. Okay. So this is from March 8th of 1881. Marx is writing to Zasulich. He says, "Dear citizen, nervous complaint which has periodically affected me for the last 10 years has prevented me from answering sooner your letter of 16 February. Excuse me." In that sense, he's referring to his health issues. Marx had a tremendous amount of health issues, especially in the last 10 years of his life. He would die in early 1883. So this letter is literally written within the last 2 years of his life. Right. "I regret that I'm unable to give you a concise account for publication of the question which you did me the honor of raising. Some months ago, I already promised a text on the same subject to St. Petersburg Committee. Still, I hope that a few lines will suffice to leave you no doubt about the way in which my so-called theory has been misunderstood." So the letter, he did write a letter to Otesestiveni Zapiski. He did write them a letter and kind of laying out what he was discussing. But let's go back to the letter here, because I think he pretty much gives you most of it in these short lines.
Okay.
In analyzing the genesis of capitalist production, I said, at the heart of the capitalist system is a complete separation of the producer from the means of production. The expropriation of the agricultural producer is the basis of the whole process. Only in England has it been accomplished in a radical manner. But all the other countries of Western Europe are following the same course. That comes from the French edition of Capital, page 315.
Okay.
The historical inevitability, quote unquote, of this course is therefore expressly restricted to the countries of Western Europe. The reason for this restriction is indicated in chapter 32. Private property founded upon personal labor is supplanted by capitalist private property, which rests on exploitation of the labor of others, on wage labor. In the Western case, then, one form of private property is transformed into another form of private property. In the case of the Russian peasants, however, their communal property would have to be transformed into private property. The analysis in Capital there provides no reasons either for or against the vitality of the Russian commune. But the special study I have made of it, including a search for the original source material, has convinced me that the commune is the fulcrum for social regeneration in Russia. But in order that it might function as such, the harmful influences assailing it on all sides must first be eliminated, and it must then be assured the normal conditions for spontaneous development. I have the honor, dear citizen, to remain yours sincerely, Karl Marx. So this is very interesting. I think that it's one piece of evidence, and Saito hangs a lot on it, but it's relevant. So when we talk about historical inevitability, Marx is making the argument that his analysis in Capital provides no reasons either for or against the vitality of the Russian commune. So he's saying right out that,
I didn't touch this.
I didn't touch this. I'm specifically referencing how capitalism has developed in Europe, specifically Britain. Right. Most of my research was done in Britain at the British Library. He lived in London for most of his life, and most of his later life, from the 1850s on, 40s maybe. And so right there, he's saying that the Russian agricultural communes don't necessarily have to go through the exact phase of social production that England did or Germany did. This is very interesting because it sort of puts to bed the notion that Marx believed in these very kind of mechanistic, deterministic stages of production that all societies had to go through. And in many ways, it kind of presages, in a radical sense, the notion of permanent revolution, which we get from Trotsky. That idea that we can kind of jump over capitalism and get to socialism by development. Like we could just jump over it. So that's there too. So now that's obviously a very different case, but it's a notion of like, you don't have to do these in like very rigid stages. Do I think that this means that Marx is completely abandoning the materialistic theory of history? No, I don't.
No.
I think what he's doing is he's using historical materialism to analyze a very specific context in which development is very, very different, say in Russia, where...
I don't know. It seems pretty clear to me that he's just taking like, okay, well, the conditions in this area had a different result and has different situations that will arise from, socialism can arise from. Like he's actually taking into account the new material conditions of other places.
Exactly. The other thing too is that this letter is a piece of evidence that challenges the traditional notion of a sort of Promethean Marxism, which is a different, more traditional view of Marxism, where it's that forces of production and the advancements of science and technology will allow us to create the conditions by which we build socialism and at the same time build a better ecology. Now, what's interesting there is that I don't necessarily think that the letter to Zasulich or any of other Marx's sort of notions of his later considerations of ecology necessarily mean that he has given up on technology. I don't think that's the case.
Right.
I think what Marx was really doing was recognizing, as you mentioned and as we've discussed, that different places go under different conditions. And as such, you sort of view them objectively and try to come up with the best way to go forward in terms of social development. But I think what's interesting here is that he's not necessarily flat out saying what Saito says he's saying. It's much more like and when he says, in the analysis in Capital, therefore, provides no reasons either for or against the vitality of the Russian commune. So he's basically saying, like, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Russian commune is the best way to go, but it doesn't necessarily mean it isn't.
Right.
So do I think that Saito might be overstating the case in the letter to Zasulich? Maybe. I think him saying that Marx was a degrowther is a bit of a stretch. I don't think that's necessarily true. Because there's really no indication that that is the case. I mean, I think Marx understood the notion of the irreparable rift between capitalist development and ecology. Like, that's pretty standard stuff. We think about when it comes to the notions of science and technology, like, Marx is pretty bullish on technology, as are most Marxists generally.
Yeah.
I don't think Marx is going to become an anarcho-primitivist anytime soon. Right. I think that's not the case. Yeah. I think what Marx was grappling with in his study of science and his study of ecology and these different modes of communal production in his later years signifies I think a maturing of his thought. It's not necessarily a complete, like, rejection of everything that came before, but more of a variation, more of a evolution of his thought, more towards recognizing that there may be different ways of getting to socialism than merely the ways that might be possible in, say, Western Europe, specifically Britain.
Like any good scientific theory, it incorporates new evidence and adapts to it.
Yes. Yeah. And Marxism was always seen that way, right? It was supposed to be seen as a science that would evolve based on information. Yeah. Now, it's not a science in sort of the hard science sense, but it is a social science.
Yeah.
And based on the methodology of historical materialism. Now, in their review for Jacobin, Lee Phillips and Matt Huber basically say that Saito is overstating the case. That one letter to some Russian socialist in the 1880s before his death means that he was a degrowther. Or at the very least, if it means something in the sense that Marx was grappling with these questions, but it doesn't necessarily like he was going to agree with every jot and tittle of whatever Saito was writing in terms of the notions of degrowth.
Right.
Because there are many more other instances in which Marx is talking about specific stages of development, and he's talking about technological advancement as well. So I think that in general, does Saito maybe overstate his case? Yeah, but I don't necessarily think that that he's wrong or that it's like completely and totally wrong. But what I do think is that it's a recapitulation, or at least what Phillips and Huber think is it's sort of a recapitulation of Malthusianism, that it's basically saying, oh, well, there are these hard limits and we can't get past these hard limits, and so we have to live with them. And it's Phillips's notion of the austerity ecology. And I mean, my thinking on that is that it's sort of, that has limits too. Like this idea that, I mean, we live in a natural world, in a natural universe in which there are limits based upon there are hard limits, but it's very hard to figure out exactly what those limits are. So, for example, when Liebig was writing about soil erosion in the mid to late 1800s, this was before the development of ammonia-based fertilizers.
Oh, yep.
Those would come into play in the early 20th century, and so we've seen a massive growth in agricultural yields precisely because of ammonia-based fertilizers. Now, those do have an environmental cost.
Yes.
And in terms of water runoff, in terms of overall soil depletion or erosion over time.
Yeah.
But there was a limit that was a natural limit, and we use science and technology to kind of get beyond that limit.
Right.
And so I think it's safe to say that, like, those limits that are within our ecology maybe aren't as hard and fast as people think they are, but they are there, right? Like, we keep talking about that. We have to keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 10 to 20 years if we want to stave off the worst effects of global climate change.
Right.
And climate change. Like that. Like, that's a hard number that has been developed via scientific research. Now, what are ways that we can combat climate change? There are many. And one of the ways we could do that is just by changing the mode of production, right? Like
Right.
it's if you move to a democratic system in which people's needs were met rather than simply the profit motive, you could get rid of a lot of junk in the economy.
Yep.
And in the latter half of the book, Saito has a lot of really interesting examples. One is Barcelona, Spain, and other examples of cities and small and other localities that have done some really interesting work in restorative agriculture, that have been using, ancient techniques from indigenous peoples to sort of rehabilitate the soil or to improve local habitats. In Barcelona's case, it's more of like participatory budgeting and participatory economics, which we talked about in the Grace Blakely episode a little bit, and about how when communities are given participatory budgeting as an example, participatory budgeting is something that we should all move towards, regardless of the ecological benefits, although of which there are many. But one of the things that's nice about participatory budgeting is that we get a sense of, when people are given a choice, would you rather have more social services or would you rather have more cops? They choose social services.
Right.
Because they know that if they choose the social services, then you may not necessarily need the cops. And so in places like Barcelona, they've done some of that, where they've been able to really invest in their communities and do the real care work that is essential. That's the other thing Saito mentions in the latter part of the book that I like as well, is that notion of care work that, which isn't particularly climate intense. It's not particularly carbon intensive to be a home health aide or to be a cook or to be a daycare provider or a school teacher. Like, these are all things in which we care for people, doctors, right? These are ways in which we can provide very needed services for people with a fairly low carbon footprint. So there are those kinds of things that we can do. And so in general, while I think maybe Saito might be over-exaggerating the lengths to which Marx changed his mind, I do think Marx evolved and in interesting ways. And I think that that's worth consideration.
Yeah, for sure. I guess just to bring up a couple comments, earlier in the stream, Velkin999 said, you can't talk too much about degrowth. There's a lot to cover.
Okay, thanks. I just hope people never get tired of it, because I think it's a really fascinating debate, and it's one that I wanted to touch on this year as we've been doing our show.
Some random geek popped in to say, "Oh my God, these leftists are talking about Karl Marx again."
We have to talk about the old man. I mean, you can't avoid it.
Yeah, that's right. Velkin999 also said, "I'm surprised Marx didn't consider that establishing a socialist society doesn't go in strict stages. The development of societies don't play out in strict steps like a game of civilization."
That's true. And I mischaracterized him, but and maybe not necessarily Marx himself, but I was sort of talking more about like sort of classical, like orthodox Marxism, where it has to go through very specific stages. And this eventually especially becomes the case with Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century, where it's very much specific stages. If you look at whether it was the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China, like, the PRC is very clear about how we get to socialism through capitalism. They're very clear about that. So maybe it's not so much Marx himself, but it's Marxism as a discipline, which is part of the reason he wrote to Zasulich, to sort of maybe clear up some of those misconceptions.
Right. Velkin999 also said, David Graeber makes a good point about that when talking about agriculture in The Dawn of Everything.
Yes, one of my favorite books. Let's see. I got it here on the shelf. Get over here. Okay, so right there. There it is.
Yeah, there it is.
I love everything. I think that's right. I think that I also read a really interesting story about some indigenous communities. They're doing some really interesting water reclamation projects. I think here in the U.S., using traditional methods and traditional materials to do water filtration. It's fantastic. And that's what I do very much believe in. I mean, I think that in the past, I've said things like, big problems require big solutions. And to some extent, I do believe in that. I mean, I do think that there are some things that we have to do on a large scale in order to solve the problem. This is where I kind of disagree somewhat with the sort of the degrowth style of, say, Saito, that says everything should really be local, although it could be. But even if things are local, they will require big projects, whether it's some kind of energy cooperatives, right? So
Yeah.
he talks about in the book about energy cooperatives, and we have rural co-ops here in America. They're called REMCs, Rural Electrification Management Cooperative or something like that. I think, but they're REMCs. They were developed out of the New Deal. They are a legacy of the New Deal. Are these programs of rural electrification where communities come together and collectively decide rates and collectively decide changes in materials and so on. So, where I grew up, in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, in Miami County, Indiana, there was Miami Cass REMC. So my local power came, at some point through a rural cooperative. Cass County is next to Miami County. It's where Logansport is. It's to the west. But anyway, yeah. So I think that's right. I mean, I think that it's a sort of all of the above approach. I'm not closing the door on the possibility of nuclear energy, although I do understand people's concerns with it. I really do.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody the other day about Google recently bought like the 25 small nuclear reactors or something.
Yeah.
And you go, okay, well, maybe I'm not in favor of that kind of thing with nuclear.
Well, and the problem is that they're doing that all in the service of AI and developing their cloud infrastructure to provide the services they do through Copilot, I think is what it's called now. Google's AI used to be called Bard, but now it's called Copilot. No, Microsoft's I think is called Copilot.
Yeah.
Gemini. Google's is called Gemini. It used to be called Bard. Microsoft's is Copilot.
Just give them decent names.
Yeah, I mean, it's like ChatGPT. It's like that doesn't particularly have a good ring to it either.
Roll off the tongue, eh?
But hey, maybe people thought about that with Google back 20 years ago. Although Google does roll off the tongue pretty nicely.
Yeah, not bad.
But anyway, yeah. So yeah, I do think that giving power back to communities to develop programs of social betterment and egalitarian and with sort of egalitarian and democratic goals, I'm all for that. I mean, I think that degrowth will require some big things. I mean, I do really believe that America, in order to really combat climate change, needs to invest in a federal high-speed rail system that would replace a lot of what is done by cars and trucks. I think if America moved more of its shipping back to trains and those trains were publicly run and publicly owned, I think we would be able to hit some of our climate targets while being able to meet people's needs. I think the other thing, too, is talking about what Saito calls the imperial mode of consumption, where he talks about how we've talked about this in other episodes, but you have the imperial core, and then you have the periphery, right? The periphery is what we would traditionally call the third world. The periphery subsidizes the core.
Yeah. And
the core is like, the OECD countries, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, anybody that belongs to NATO, that's the imperial core, right? Yeah. And so, for us living in the core, we do have a higher standard of living, often as the result of the exploitation of people in the periphery. For people who are in countries that are essentially neo-colonies of the United States or France or whoever.
This is a sticking point between me and my partner, Pam, is that every time I talk about the rich, she's like, motherfucker, you're the rich. When you take the whole world into account, you, the middle-class earner in Canada, is the 1%.
Yes, and Saito makes that argument too, is that, the richest 10% of the world are subsidized by the rest of the 90%.
Yeah.
And so we do have a very high standard of living relative to a very large chunk of the world.
Yeah.
That I do think is a huge problem.
For sure.
And the main critique I've heard of this is basically that it's a messaging problem. Like it's Americans, and this is how Huber and Phillips start their argument, where they talk about how, what are you talking about, imperial mode of living? Like Americans, like their wages haven't kept up with productivity, despite the fact that Americans are more productive than ever, that we keep living with austerity, where public goods keep getting slashed and privatized and destroyed, and things keep costing more and more. We get less and less for it. Like, Americans do live fairly precarious lives in ways that they didn't, say, a generation or two ago.
Yeah.
So it is important to say, like, oh, you're part of the imperial mode of living. Yeah, that's technically true, but all of us live poorly compared to what we could.
Yeah, and all in the name of the most rich taking their profits off of the top of everyone.
Exactly.
Like maybe you could say that a phone would cost 10 times as much if we paid the African continent what they actually deserve for the materials. But maybe we could make up for that if we took that out of the hands of the people who are profiting off it.
Right. Because why does it cost 10 times more? It costs that because they have to generate a profit, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's predicated on growth, that you have to have constant growth. And the way to grow is by subsuming other economies. Part of that is, I mean, that's how, in a lot of ways, globalization happened, where, former countries of the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, I just finished Michael Praney's book on Yugoslavia, where, these countries were sort of, they were stripped of their public parts and were sort of sold off at, bottom prices, bottom of the barrel prices, and were privatized to the point where people's standard of living in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is far worse today than, say, it was 40 years ago when the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia still existed, despite the fact that there were problems then, that it's actually worse now in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And same in America. I mean, arguably, is the standard of living in America as good today as it was 40 years ago? No. I mean, not in terms of your ability to get an education, your ability to buy a home, your ability to put food on the table, to be able to raise children. Like, no, like our standard of living is worse today than it was 40 years ago.
Yeah, like you think, like you or I probably make more than our parents or grandparents did in terms of dollars.
Real dollars. And not real dollars, but in overall dollars, but in real dollars adjusting for inflation, we don't.
We don't. We probably make way less, actually.
Yes. And Americans do. Wages have not kept up with productivity in America since the 1970s. The graph is astounding. I've seen it in multiple books. And so when you think about all of that, it's really hard to go to people who are struggling in America and go, see, you're the problem.
Yeah.
Your imperial mode of living, that's the problem. And it's like, my big issue is that instead of, like a good Marxist, like analyzing, well, these are part of the broader structural forces, and that's what the imperial mode of living is built upon.
Yeah.
Saito tends to not do that. He tends to talk more about like, well, if people would just give this up or give that up, and it's like, no, don't give me that sort of crunchy left shit.
Right.
Tell me, recognize that the problem isn't so much that Americans live too high, because a lot of Americans don't.
Yeah.
Most Americans can't afford a $400 or $500 or $1,000 emergency. Most Americans can't.
Right.
Savings are most Americans don't have savings in the way that they did 2 generations ago.
Yeah.
So Americans live very precarious lives. Millions of Americans live in poverty, including children. So this idea that they're living real high on the hog at the expense of the global periphery is kind of bullshit, because a lot of Americans don't live that well.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to recognize that the problem isn't necessarily like the 10%, although that would be a problem. The problem is like the 1%, or 1/10 of 1%, the uber billionaires, the people who own everything. Because even though we may have technically like a better mode of living than, say, somebody in the periphery, which is true in many respects, without a doubt.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean that our standard of living is fantastic or that it's better, because it's not. Because you have to think about how in America there's an imperial core. There's a ruling class core that feeds off of the periphery. That's how any country is, right? So a lot of us have to our work is never fully benefited us. And so it's very hard to kind of say, oh, well, you need to give up things. When Americans have had to give up a lot over the last 4 years. So I think that's a hard sell. But it's not that Saito is wrong. It's just that the framing of it doesn't recognize those differences.
Right. You also have to put in the existing power structures and systems of exploitation, and so that you can recognize all of the various levels of it, rather than just saying, well, you no, you, the guy that buys coffee every day at Starbucks, you don't get to anymore.
Yes, exactly. Which, I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Some of the things he talks about sort of the cheap consumerism, like I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, but part of it is that Americans do not have a choice. They don't. Most Americans can't afford to spend money on like certified organic artisanal carrots. Like they just don't. Like most Americans don't have that. Most Americans don't know how to garden. I certainly don't know how to garden.
Right.
He does mention in the book the victory gardens that were during World War II, and there was a sizable percentage of the country in America who had gardens by the end of World War II, which is, I think, a hell of a public achievement. But again, that all goes away by the 1950s. I mean,
Right.
by the time you get into the heyday of American consumerism in the 50s and 60s, that's gone. You know, that notion of community gardens or shared sacrifice, that's all done. So you could make the argument that American consumerism or that sort of imperial mode of consuming is a problem. And I agree that it is. And so that's always been the question I always have about degrowth is how do you square that circle of you want to meet people's needs and you want to build a life for people where they can get their needs met, food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, social interaction, all those good things. How do you do that while at the same time lessening the overall economy? That seems difficult to me. And I guess part of it is just recognizing that we live in a world that commodifies everything, that the commodity form is truly the problem. And if you get rid of the commodity form and you go back to, use value instead of exchange value, because that's really the big difference, right? Classic Marxism, you have use value, which is like, I have my water bottle. My water bottle has use value to me. It holds my water. I can drink my water. I can refill it. I don't have to buy other plastic bottles. It's useful to me, right? Yeah. Whereas exchange value is like this in the market is worth a particular amount. I bought this one at Goodwill for $2. That was its exchange value. Okay. Mind you, I bought this, I think, pre-pandemic. So this would probably be $5 at Goodwill now. So yeah, like we have a system that's built upon exchange value. It doesn't matter what the use is. It just matters if it generates profit via exchange.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have a company like Shein, which is like an environmental disaster. Yeah. Or fast fashion in general. But it's very hard for people who don't have a lot of money to buy clothes.
Yeah, like we used to talk, I remember like about people going to Walmart, right? Like you'd say, well, they exploit their workers, they don't pay them enough, maybe we shouldn't support them as a business. But then you're like, okay, but how else am I going to pay for food when that's the cheapest place to buy it, right?
Yes, that's right. And it's the same with clothing too. There are a lot of people whose options are limited in terms of clothing. Having said that, though, my wife and I are having this conversation. I think it's pretty relevant to this conversation. We were talking about clothing because my wife hates Shein. She's like vehemently against it, as am I. And she was talking about how the reason that people use it so much is because it's one of the ways that they can get things that are on trend,
right?
Affordably. And my thought is, why the fuck do we have trends? Who gives a shit what the trends are? Yeah. Like, that's just like to me, that's like pure capitalist propaganda. Like, I don't care what trend something is.
Yeah, celebrity called different clothes or whatever. Right?
It's like, and so it just becomes all of this cheap clothing that's made out of plastic that doesn't disintegrate because a lot of Shein's shit's just made out of polyester. Yeah. And so we're adding to all this plastic waste of a shirt you may only wear once and then you get a hole in it or it rips. Hell, it could rip while you're wearing it.
They're fragile as fuck, but also they won't break down in a landfill. Yeah. So
they won't break down in a landfill, but they will break down in your washing machine. Yeah. So it's like this very interesting mix. And so the idea of trends is like absurd. Like if we lived in a healthy, flourishing society, you wouldn't have this notion of trends. You have clothes that would look attractive, that would look nice, but would also serve a function. You wouldn't necessarily have to get brand new clothes every month or every quarter. Maybe you'd have fewer items of clothing, but ones that are more durable. Now, am I perfect on that? No. I mean, a lot of my clothes are Old Navy. Right. I like Old Navy a lot because they make affordable clothes for tall, fat people. And I'm a tall, fat person. So it's easier to buy clothes from them than it would, because there's certain stores I can't just walk into and buy pants off the rack on. I'm too big. Right. So I know that if I buy from them, I know it will fit me because I have that experience with them. but all of my clothing, every piece of clothing I own fits in one small closet in this office. That's all I've got. I don't have anything else. And so, but that's me, Now, as you can see, am I immune from consumerism? No. I have a ton of books. I love books. I collect books. I buy stuff all the time. But most of the books that I buy are used.
Yeah.
I rarely buy new books. Most of them are upcycled. I buy them at book sales, or I buy them at thrift stores or secondhand stores. I very much believe in the not just the sharing economy, but sort of the upcycled economy where, here's where I'm going to do my little pitch again. I very much believe in something called, I don't know what you'd call it. I call it the Federal Bureau of Repairs and Replacements.
Yeah.
My idea of, let's say your toaster breaks down and it's a very easy fix. You can take it to the Federal Bureau of Repairs and Replacements. They'll either repair it for you for free or for a very nominal fee. Something like for $5, we'll fix your toaster. Perfect. Because we live in a world now where if your toaster breaks down, it is literally cheaper to buy a new one and throw the old one out than it is to fix it. And that's a huge problem. Same with shoes, right? Most people don't fix their shoes. 100 years ago, most shoes were not mass produced, and the ones that were mass produced were mostly probably military ones. And you owned a couple pairs of shoes in your life, and they constantly got resold or refitted or whatever by cobblers. They were made of leather or some other material. They would last for a long time.
Yeah, there was a profession for that.
Yeah, there was a full profession. People had professions. Hell, when I was a kid, there were still shoe repair places. I mean, they were in the mall. You could go to the mall and there was a shoe repair place. So I very much believe in all of that. I mean, I think that's the future. For example, I use a laptop computer, a MacBook that is 14 years old. It's almost 15 years old, okay? I rebuilt it in 2018. I put a whole new hard drive in it and new RAM. But I've had the computer for 14 years. It's so old that the serial number on the bottom of it is wearing out. But I have it and it works. The iMac that I'm using to stream tonight is an iMac we've had since, I think, 2015.
Right.
I rehabbed that one too, where I put a new hard drive in it because it got fried when our power went out in January. I love fixing things and I believe in fixing things, but we don't live in a culture that believes in that. And so I think more than just getting rid of the commodity form, although I agree with that, and moving to a use-based economy, the other thing is also just moving to an economy that's predicated on building things to last, things that people could consume and enjoy for a long time that could be fixed. Yeah. Or if they can't be fixed, that they could be disposed of properly. Yeah. So one of the organizations that I absolutely love and have done incredible work, and it's something I would support in our degrowth future, it's called the Ocean Cleanup. It's a nonprofit that goes to all over the world, and they've developed all these really interesting ways of getting plastic garbage out of the ocean and out of rivers and streams. So they'll go to places like Guatemala and Sri Lanka and the Pacific Garbage Patch in the Pacific Ocean. For those who don't know, there is a massive, massive patch of garbage in the Pacific Ocean that's the size of some states, some U.S. states. It's huge. And it's in sort of the middle of the Pacific Ocean because of ocean currents and the way that the tectonic plates move in that part of the world, because you have the Ring of Fire in the Pacific Ocean, where that's where a lot of tectonic activity is, a lot of volcanoes and stuff. It's like Hawaii, or Polynesians or the Polynesian islands or whatever, Polynesia. But there's this giant Pacific garbage patch, and they go out and they clean it up. They go out and they fix it. And they try to get rid of it. And then they use the plastic that they find to make things. So they'll make in the past, people have used plastic to make fleece clothing. Now, we've talked before about how plastic recycling largely is a scam. And it was one that was pushed by the plastics industry in order to sort of get the burden off of the producers and onto consumers. Yeah. And a lot of the sort of degrowth discussion often focuses on the consumer. Well, what can you do? I can take shorter showers, or I can, wear clothes until they completely wear out or get them repaired. And all those are good things. Those are all things I believe in. Sure. But at the end of the day, the problem is that our economy is built on constant growth because in capitalism, you either grow or you die. And so if we built a system that wasn't so predicated on growth, we could live in a better world that would fulfill people's needs without having to make so much stuff. I mean, think of all of, I think about this now, especially as an adult. All the plastic toys I had as a kid, like all the toys that kids accumulate over the years.
And they just end up in the garbage.
They just end up in the garbage.
Yeah. No, it's.
Do we have any other comments? Or sorry,
well, actually, no, that's all right. There was quite a few going on here. I kind of lost track of things.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. I was thinking, I know I always go back to it, but in an interview a while ago, I asked a guy about degrowth, and he said, well, we really don't need the glow in the dark plastic dog poop or whatever.
Yes, I agree.
And it's that's where I really think we could make some changes, is just the massive overproduction of things that end up in landfills because nobody actually buys them or nobody cares about owning them in any way.
Yep. It's the crisis of overproduction, right? This is one of the chaos agents of capitalism.
Yeah.
I think about in terms of the making of masks during the pandemic. Since so much of American production was sent overseas, we couldn't really make masks here. And then we sort of retooled things to make masks, and now we have too many of them, when people made way too many, because it's not on any rational basis. It's all based upon profit.
Yeah. Yeah, so it seems like there's a few corners that could be cut, right?
Oh, yeah. For example, I mean, we can get this close to home. I just got this in the mail. It's like a little fidget toy.
Okay.
And they're magnetic, and you can move it around and move stuff around. It's cute, but did I need this? No. The reason I bought it was because I'm a part of a online secret shopper network where I buy products and review them. So I'm as much of the problem as anybody.
Right.
But remember, kids, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. That's not to say that you can't make better choices. You certainly should when you can. But just recognize we're all to blame.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, I guess we're pretty close to wrapping it up. So what are we covering next time?
So before we get into what I wanted to next time, I just wanted to mention that people should read this book. People should definitely check it out. I think it's as good. Is it as good as Jason Hickel's book? No. I think Hickel's is the best case for degrowth. I think his book is the best case. But I really like that Saito is sort of reviewing Marx in a different way to try to get us to think differently about Marxism and ecology. And I think that's really worth checking out. So I like the book very, very much. And I'm glad we covered it. And so I would recommend people read it and then read Matt Huber and Lee Phillips's response in Jacobin. So you get you can kind of read the debate. And maybe we can put that in the show notes.
For sure.
But in terms of next time, I am currently working on a talk that I'm going to be giving in 2 weeks. And so the book that we're going to be covering in 2 weeks will also be the book I'm going to be talking about in that talk. It's a book that's written in the late 1960s. We're going back to Erich Fromm, who I love very, very much. His form of Marxist humanism is very much my worldview in a lot of ways. And in 1968, he put out a book called The Revolution of Hope Towards a Humanized Technology. And that's the book we're going to cover next time.
Cool.
I am obsessed with following all things tech. I'm a huge fan of Paris Marx. We've covered Paris's book on the show.
Yep.
I also listen to Better Offline, Ed Zitron's podcast, which is fabulous. And so that's what we're going to talk about next time, is how technology in modern life alienates us, degrades us, and how to build a world in which we can use technology for the greater good, and to build that world beyond capitalism, build that world beyond the imperatives of the profit motive, which kind of next time's episode will dovetail a lot with what we've discussed tonight.
Very cool. I guess that just leaves, where can people find you?
As always, you can find me here at justinclark.org.
Right.
All of my writing is there, my short book reviews, blog posts that I've been putting out this year, and then the written version of my talk will be on the blog within the next couple of weeks. And then I'm still it'll be probably long in the future, not too long because I want to get it out before the end of the year, but I'm also still working on that retrospective blog post about Green Day's American Idiot, which turns 20 years old this year. And so the special edition box set I'm getting it in the mail on Friday. So I'm going to listen to all of it and listen to a lot of the demos and stuff and kind of give people a personal reflection on why American Idiot is very important to me.
Very cool.
And that'll be that. And then, as always, please consider becoming a patron, patreon.com/skeptical leftist. Kohei has done an incredible amount of work in the last few weeks. He did a tweet or a thread today where he was like, oh, I did this recording yesterday. I'm doing red reviews today, and I did this other thing, and I love it. And it's like, so see how happy he is
going on. Yeah.
See how happy he is doing all that work. Well, you can make him more happy by supporting it.
Yeah.
So by becoming a patron, you get the pre-games and the post-games here of Red Reviews and all of his other shows.
Yep.
You'll also get them in advance.
Yep.
I don't know how many days in advance. Is it?
It's still only 2 days, but it's still in advance.
Still in advance. You get them 2 days in advance. And then, I don't know if we've ever talked about doing this at some point, but if there was ever if we ever wanted to do like a Patreon Q&A where if we have particular patrons at a certain level, we could do like a Q&A with them. That might be a good idea if people are interested in that. Maybe throw that in the Discord or in the Patreon. Say like, hey, would you like to do a Q&A with us? Like live? Would you like to be in on it?
For sure.
I'm open to that.
Cool.
But yeah, it takes a lot of work. Kohei puts a lot of work into this show. And he does a fabulous job. He makes my life so easy. All I have to do is read these books and then shoot off my mouth for an hour, but he does all of the other really hard work. So please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/skeptical leftist.
And I guess for our, we just, last week we did the live stream. I fast-paced that, so it's coming out on 2 days for the public. It's coming out again, like an edited version, 2 days before the election. And then I just did a great interview with some psychoanalysts who talk about their book, Gender Without Identity. I'm fast-pacing that, so that's going to be out right the weekend after the election. So there's some really cool stuff coming out pretty quick. And then, of course, the next Red Reviews that'll be edited is for libertarian communism. So
awesome.
Lots coming.
And then the Judith Butler episode will come out, which will complement your conversation with the psychoanalysts, I think, hopefully.
Yeah.
It's been amazing. I look back on it and I'm like, wow, we've done a lot.
Yeah.
And it's great. And we appreciate all of the really great comments tonight. Really appreciate all of your questions and your comments. Thank you guys for everybody who's been a part of the stream. And thank you all for being a part of this community that we're building here.
For sure. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a good one.
See you next time.
All right, folks, that's all for now. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me keep the power on. Thanks to my top patrons, Damian Marie Athope, Some Random Geek, Justin Clark, Dan F. Smith, and Lisa Glass. And thank you to my new patrons. You can stay tuned for the list of patrons at the end to see your name listed. If you aren't a patron and want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send a one-time donation to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. I also have a Substack where you can subscribe for free or you can donate per month. And lastly, you can get a paid subscription on Spotify that will give you the same access to bonus content and extra long episodes. If you can't contribute financially, then I would like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all my stuff, or check out my link tree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalleftist. That's where you can find all of my social media spaces and communities. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening or watching. Make sure to leave a comment on the video, join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda. Also, stick around for a clip from this episode's post-show chat.
don't give a damn about you. They don't give a shit.
Right.
You know, that asshole in Texas made a decision that affected your life greatly, and he didn't even know your fucking name.
Yeah, that's right. He knew I was a number somewhere.
Yes, I was. Yes, you're a number.
Employee number, right? whatever.
Yep. And you know, and I work for state government, so sometimes if a particularly terrible, you know, administration comes in, I have to deal with their shit.
Yeah.
And instead of them leaving, you know, nonpartisan civil servants alone, which is what I am. You know, I go out of my way. I mean, I write a lot about labor history and I write about politics, but I also try very, very hard to be nonpartisan in my position. I do this work, and this is my private work. I do this on my own time. I don't, you know, but I'm very clear about how I run my job because I care very deeply about what I do. And I respect people's rights to different opinions.